I had been looking forward to the camping trip for weeks. It was supposed to be simple, nothing special, just a few days out in the woods away from work and all the noise of regular life. I wanted the quiet, the open space, the kind of tiredness that comes from walking all day instead of sitting at a desk. I packed carefully. My backpack was heavy with gear. A tent, a sleeping bag, extra food, water filter, flashlight, knife, rope, and a small first aid kit. I checked and rechecked everything because I didn't want to be caught unprepared. The plan was to hike into the woods, find a good spot by the lake, set up camp, and spend a couple of nights alone. I drove out early in the morning. The road narrowed the farther I went, trees closing in on both sides. It was late summer, the air still warm but carrying the faint bite of fall. By the time I parked the car at the small trailhead, the sun was already climbing higher. The lot was empty. That comforted me. I wanted the solitude. I slung my backpack over my shoulders, locked the car, and started walking. The first few miles of the trail were easy. Packed dirt, some rocks, nothing difficult. Birds moved between the branches. The air smelled of pine and earth. My boots crunched with each step. As I hiked deeper, the trail grew quieter. The sound of the road faded until it was only the occasional hum of the wind above me. I stopped once or twice to drink water and wipe the sweat off my forehead. By afternoon, I reached the lake. The water was still, reflecting the trees around it like a mirror. The surface barely rippled except when insects touched it or a fish jumped. I felt calm standing there. I picked a spot not too far from the shore but far enough back where the ground was flat and dry. I unstrapped my pack and began setting up camp. The tent went up after some work. The sleeping bag unrolled neatly inside. I gathered small sticks and some bigger branches from the ground, stacking them for a fire. After everything was set, I sat on a log and ate a quick meal: jerky, trail mix, a granola bar. My stomach wasn't very hungry, but I knew I had to eat. As the sun dropped, the air cooled. I lit the fire carefully, using some dry leaves as kindling. The flames caught and soon the wood cracked and popped. I sat watching it grow darker around me. The first night was quiet. I lay in my tent, listening to the distant calls of birds that hunted at night. Crickets chirped endlessly. At one point I thought I heard something moving near the water, a splash or rustle, but I told myself it was probably a fish or an animal coming to drink. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me and drifted into a light sleep. The next day, I decided to hike around the lake and explore. I carried only a small day pack with water, some snacks, and my knife. The trail was faint but manageable. The ground was uneven, roots twisting up like ropes. A few times I had to stop and push through thick brush. The lake glittered between the trees as I circled it. On the far side, I found signs of another old campsite. A blackened ring of stones from an old fire pit, bits of burnt wood scattered. No one had been there in a long time. Grass and weeds had grown up through the stones. I crouched and studied it for a while, wondering who had stayed here and why they never came back. It gave me a strange feeling, but I brushed it off. By late afternoon, I made it back to my own camp. I collected more wood, refilled my water bottles with filtered lake water, and ate another simple meal. The fire helped keep the chill away as darkness fell. I sat staring at the flames until I grew too tired and crawled into the tent again. That night, I woke to a sound. It was faint, but enough to stir me from sleep. My heart thudded in my chest as I lay still, listening. Something moved outside the tent. Leaves crunched softly under weight, not like a rabbit or raccoon, heavier. My throat went dry. I lay there, barely breathing, hoping it would pass. Minutes dragged by. Then the sound stopped. Silence pressed in around me. I waited longer before finally convincing myself it was just a deer. Slowly, I drifted back to sleep, though unease curled in my stomach. The third day, I decided to hike deeper into the woods, away from the lake. I followed a game trail that led uphill. The climb was steep, sweat running down my back. From the top, I could see the trees stretching endlessly, a green sea with no end. The air smelled sharper up there, cooler. I sat on a rock, drank water, and chewed on some jerky. The quiet was heavy. I realized then just how far I was from everything. No cell service, no roads, no voices. Just me. That was the point, but at that moment it felt less freeing and more isolating. On the way back down, I noticed something odd. A tree with its bark stripped away in wide, rough lines. Claw marks. They were high up, higher than my chest. Too wide for a small animal. I stared at them, unease creeping back. A bear, I thought. It had to be. I stepped back and kept moving, my pace quickening. When I returned to camp, everything was the same, but my comfort was gone. The quiet felt different now, heavier. I kept looking over my shoulder as I gathered more firewood. The sun sank lower, shadows stretching. I cooked a small meal over the fire and ate quickly. My eyes kept scanning the tree line. Every little sound made me twitch. That night, the noises came again. This time, they were closer. Slow, deliberate steps. My pulse raced as I lay frozen in my sleeping bag. I reached for the flashlight and clicked it on. The beam lit the thin tent walls, casting shadows. I thought I saw movement outside, just the edge of something. I held the knife tight in my hand, though I knew it wouldn't matter much against a bear. The footsteps moved away eventually, fading into the distance. I lay awake the rest of the night, ears straining, heart pounding. By morning, I was exhausted. My hands shook slightly as I packed some gear into my day pack. I needed to check the area again to make sure it was safe. I walked along the trail that led back toward the car, just to see how far I was. The walk felt longer than before. A few miles in, I found something that froze me in place. Footprints, not boots, bare feet, human but wide, rough with dirt packed into the grooves. They trailed along the edge of the path before disappearing into the brush. My stomach tightened. The prints weren't old. The edges were sharp, no signs of rain or wind wearing them down. I crouched, staring at them, my mind racing. Who would be out here without shoes? Why hadn't I seen anyone else around? I backed away and returned to camp. Every step I felt watched. The woods no longer felt calm. They felt alive in a way that unsettled me. Back at camp, I double-checked my gear, making sure everything was close at hand. Knife, flashlight, food. I debated leaving right then, hiking all the way back to the car, but it was already late in the day. I didn't want to get caught in the woods at night without shelter. That evening, I kept the fire bigger than usual, the flames leaping higher. I sat close, scanning the shadows. My ears caught every sound, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves. My skin prickled with tension. When I finally lay in the tent, I couldn't close my eyes. The forest creaked and shifted around me. Then I heard it. Slow steps again, circling the camp. My breath caught. The sound of something dragging lightly across the ground, moving closer. I gripped the knife so tight my knuckles ached. I didn't move, barely breathed. The sound lingered, then faded into the distance. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay. The trip was ruined. I needed to get out. I packed quickly, shoving everything into my backpack. My hands shook as I tore down the tent. The fire pit was still warm when I left. The trail back to the car felt endless. My legs burned, my throat dry, but I pushed harder. Every sound made me snap my head around. At one point, I thought I saw movement through the trees, a shape slipping behind a trunk. But when I looked again, nothing. Hours later, I finally reached the trailhead. My car sat just as I had left it, sun glinting off the roof. Relief flooded me. I climbed inside, locked the doors, and sat gripping the wheel. My shirt clung with sweat, my chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. I drove away without looking back. The woods shrank in the rearview mirror until they disappeared. Even now, thinking about it, I can feel that same unease crawling through me. I don't know who or what was out there. I never saw clearly, but the footprints, the sounds, the feeling of being watched, they were real. And that was enough to make sure I never went camping alone again. I had always liked camping, but this trip was supposed to be something different. I wanted time away from work, noise, and endless distractions. I wanted to sit in the quiet woods, hear only the sound of water, wind, and the occasional bird, and remind myself of what it felt like to be away from phones and screens. It was the middle of September, cool enough at night to need a sleeping bag, but still warm enough during the day to enjoy long hikes. I packed my gear carefully, making sure I had enough food, water filters, a good tent, a knife, a lantern, and everything else I thought I might need. I wanted to camp far enough from other people that I could be alone, but not so far that I couldn't get back if something went wrong. I drove for hours until I reached a forested area near a large lake. The map showed scattered camping spots, but most of them were clustered near parking areas or trails. I wanted somewhere quieter. I parked my car in a gravel lot that was half empty, tightened the straps on my pack, and started walking down a narrow dirt trail that bent through thick trees. The smell of pine needles filled the air, and the sound of my boots crunching on dry soil echoed louder than I expected. I carried a full pack with tent poles strapped to the side and a rolled sleeping bag tied tightly to the bottom. After a couple of hours, I found a small clearing near a stream that fed into the lake. It looked perfect. The ground was level, there was soft dirt for my tent, and the stream would give me easy water to filter. The clearing was surrounded by trees on all sides, tall ones with thick trunks, and I could hear the faint sound of water moving over rocks. It was far enough off the trail that I couldn't see or hear anyone passing by. This was exactly what I wanted. I set up my tent, staked it down firmly, and laid out my sleeping bag and pad inside. The air was already cooling as the sun shifted behind the tree line, and long shadows stretched across the clearing. I boiled some water on my small camp stove, ate a packet of dried food, and then sat quietly with my back against a log, listening. I didn't hear much besides the steady trickle of the stream and the occasional call of a bird. It was peaceful. I stayed there until the sky began to turn orange and then slowly faded to gray. When the darkness came, it came fast. Out in the woods, without city lights, the night swallowed everything almost instantly. I lit my lantern and hung it inside my tent. Its soft yellow glow spilled across the fabric, making it look like a small glowing box in the middle of black woods. I crawled into my sleeping bag and tried to relax. First, I drifted in and out of light sleep. The forest wasn't completely silent. Every now and then I heard leaves crunch, branches snap, or small animals rustle in the brush. I had camped enough to know that most of it was harmless. Raccoons, squirrels, maybe deer moving through. I reminded myself that the woods were full of life and that being nervous about it was pointless. Still, the longer I lay there, the more every sound seemed amplified. It was sometime after midnight when I woke again. The lantern had burned out, leaving me in total darkness. I lay still, trying to remember what had woken me. Then I heard it, a slow crunch of leaves just beyond the clearing. It wasn't the quick scurrying of an animal. It was deliberate, heavy, and spaced apart, like footsteps. I held my breath. The sound came again, closer this time, and then stopped. The night felt too still, too quiet, as if the entire forest was holding its breath with me. I slowly reached for the knife I had kept near my sleeping bag. The handle felt cold against my palm. My heart hammered so loudly in my chest that I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. Minutes passed with no sound. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or maybe a large raccoon moving slowly through the brush. But the sound had been different. It had weight. After what felt like an hour, I finally let myself breathe normally again. I eventually fell back into a shallow sleep, but I kept waking, startled by faint noises outside. Sometimes it was the distant snap of a branch, sometimes a rustle in the brush, sometimes nothing at all except the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the time the sky began to lighten, I hadn't gotten more than an hour of solid rest. Morning brought me some relief. The sun cut through the trees, lighting the clearing and making it feel less threatening. I made coffee on my small stove and tried to shake off the unease from the night. Maybe it had been my imagination, exaggerated by the darkness. I decided to spend the day hiking a bit farther from camp to clear my head. I followed the stream toward the lake, moving slowly and stopping often to listen. The forest looked calm in daylight, almost too normal to have caused the fear I felt last night. I reached the edge of the lake by noon and sat on a rock, eating a protein bar while watching the water shimmer. The air was cool. The surface of the lake rippled with wind, and there wasn't a single person in sight. I hiked back to camp in the afternoon. The tent stood just where I had left it, nothing disturbed. That reassured me. I gathered more wood for a small fire, filtered more water from the stream, and cooked another simple meal. As the sun dipped again, I tried to tell myself the second night would be easier now that I was more used to the sounds of the forest. But when night came again, the same uneasiness returned. The dark pressed against my tent like a weight. Around midnight, I heard it again. Slow, deliberate crunching in the brush. This time, it circled. I could hear the steps moving around the clearing, then stopping, then starting again. The air grew colder inside the tent. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the knife so tightly that my hand hurt. I listened to the sound move slowly around me, and at one point, I swore it came within a few feet of the tent wall. The thin fabric between me and whatever was outside felt useless. I thought about unzipping the tent and shining my flashlight, but something in me froze. I didn't want to see what was out there. The footsteps continued for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, they faded into the distance. I didn't sleep at all after that. I just lay in silence, waiting, until the sky turned gray with dawn. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was packing up and leaving. I hadn't seen another person, but something or someone had been out there 2 nights in a row, circling my camp. I didn't want to spend another night wondering if they would come closer. I stuffed my gear into my pack as quickly as I could, collapsed the tent, and strapped everything tight. I left the clearing and started back toward the trail. The forest felt different now, less peaceful and more watchful. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following. The walk back felt endless. Every crack of a branch behind me made me spin around, my heart racing. But the trail remained empty. I passed the stream, the trees, the winding bends, and finally reached the gravel lot. My car was still there, undisturbed. When I climbed inside and locked the doors, I finally felt a wave of relief. I sat there for several minutes, hands shaking on the steering wheel, staring at the forest as if it might reveal what had stalked me in the night. Nothing moved. It was just trees and shadows. I started the engine and drove away, the tires crunching on gravel, the woods slowly fading in the rearview mirror. I never found out what had circled my tent those nights. Maybe it was just a curious animal that sounded heavier than it was. Maybe it was another person wandering the woods at night for reasons I didn't want to know. Whatever it was, I knew I had made the right choice to leave. Camping had always been my way to relax, to clear my head. But after that trip, I learned how quickly peace could turn into fear, how the quiet of the woods could hide something watching, moving slowly just out of sight. And that fear stayed with me long after I left, long after I unpacked my gear and tried to sleep in the comfort of my own bed. I realized that sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see. It's what you hear in the dark and can't explain. The sound of footsteps where there shouldn't be any, the silence that follows, and the knowledge that you were not as alone as you thought. I always thought camping was supposed to be peaceful. People say it's about escaping the noise, slowing down, and breathing in clean air. I had camped before in small groups and never had any issues. But the trip I'm about to describe is something that still sits heavy in my mind. It was meant to be just one night out in the woods, away from my normal routine, but it ended up being the most terrifying night of my life. Not because of anything supernatural or strange, but because of how quickly things can go wrong when you're alone, tired, and vulnerable in a place where no one can help you. I had planned it about a week in advance. I chose a spot I had seen marked on a hiking forum, a small clearing a couple of miles off a side trail in the forest. It wasn't a proper campground with amenities, but that was the appeal. I wanted quiet, just me and the trees. I packed my gear carefully. A 2-person tent, sleeping bag, sleeping pad, food, stove, headlamp, first aid kit, and a small hatchet. I also carried a knife, more out of habit than necessity. I made sure I had plenty of water and a backup filter in case I needed to refill from a creek. The morning of the trip, the sky was clear, the air a little cool, the kind of day that makes you think the night will be crisp but manageable. I drove out to the trailhead, parked my car in the small dirt lot, and checked my phone. I already knew there'd be no service once I hiked in. I wasn't worried. I had given my brother the details of where I'd be, just in case. I locked my car, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started hiking. The trail was quiet, only the crunch of my boots and the sounds of birds overhead. I saw no one else that day, which was surprising but also exactly what I wanted. The forest was thick in some parts, open in others. After about an hour, I found the faint side path that the forum had mentioned. It was narrow and partly overgrown, but still easy enough to follow. After another 30 minutes, I came to the clearing. It was small, ringed by tall pines, with a thin line of trees opening up to what looked like the dry bed of an old creek. It looked perfect to me. I set my pack down, wiped sweat from my face, and just stood there for a few minutes, taking in the quiet. There was no wind, no voices, nothing but the occasional creak of branches. I felt good about my choice. I set up camp slowly, wanting to enjoy the process. I cleared a flat spot, pitched the tent, rolled out my sleeping pad and bag inside, and placed my gear neatly near the entrance. After that, I gathered some wood for a small fire. I had brought a stove, but nothing beats sitting by a fire in the woods. By late afternoon, I had everything ready. My food was simple freeze-dried meals, some trail mix, jerky, and a couple of energy bars. The sun dropped behind the trees, and the clearing grew dim. I lit the fire, sat by it, and ate. It was peaceful, almost too quiet, but I didn't mind. I thought about how most people would never know this spot existed. That made me feel lucky, like I had found a secret. When darkness settled in, the forest changed. It wasn't the same friendly place it had been in the daylight. The trees seemed closer, the shadows thicker. The fire's glow only pushed the darkness back so far, and beyond that was a wall of black. Every small sound stood out. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. I reminded myself it was just animals, maybe deer or raccoons. Still, being alone made every noise seem sharper. I sat up for a while, feeding the fire, listening, letting my eyes adjust. At some point, I heard what sounded like movement off to the right, beyond the trees. It wasn't steady, more like short bursts of crunching leaves. I froze, staring into the dark, waiting. It stopped. Then, after a long pause, I heard it again, this time a little closer. My first thought was a deer. My second thought was something bigger, like a bear. I had bear spray in my pack, but my heart still picked up speed. I told myself not to panic. I made the fire a bit bigger, figuring the light would help. I didn't hear anything else for a while, and eventually I convinced myself it was nothing. By around 11, I was ready to sleep. I put out most of the fire, leaving only a few glowing embers. I crawled into the tent, zipped it closed, and lay on my back, listening to the night. First, it was hard to relax. Every sound seemed amplified. I shifted around, pulled the sleeping bag tighter, and tried to steady my breathing. Somewhere deep in the night, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, but it was close. My ears strained. It was footsteps, slow, careful footsteps outside my tent. My body went rigid. I held my breath and listened. They circled partway around, then stopped. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then I heard the faint crunch of leaves again, moving away. I didn't move for what felt like forever. My chest hurt from holding my breath. Finally, I let it out slowly, my heart racing. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it have been an animal? But footsteps had a pattern, a rhythm that animals usually don't make. These sounded like a person. I thought about unzipping the tent and looking, but the idea of exposing myself like that froze me. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the knife I had pulled from my bag. I waited, every sense straining. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I must have dozed off. When I opened my eyes again, dawn was just starting to lighten the sky. I sat up, stiff and tired, and slowly unzipped the tent. The clearing looked normal. The fire pit was cold. The trees were the same. But when I walked the edge of the clearing, I saw something that stopped me. In the dirt near the creek bed were faint impressions. Footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine. I could see the difference in tread. My stomach turned. Someone had been here, close to me, while I slept. I didn't waste time. I packed up quickly, stuffing everything back into my bag in a rush. My hands shook as I worked. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone step out from behind the trees. By the time I had my pack on, I was sweating even though the air was cool. The hike back to the main trail felt longer than it had the day before. Every sound made me whip my head around. I kept imagining someone following just out of sight. I pushed hard, barely stopping, until I reached the trailhead. My car was there, untouched. I tossed my pack inside, locked the doors, and sat behind the wheel, trying to calm down. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror. The whole time, one thought stayed with me. Someone had walked around my tent in the middle of the night. They hadn't tried to steal anything. They hadn't made themselves known. They had just walked close, circled, and left. That was worse than anything else because it meant I had no idea what they wanted. I never went back to that spot. I still camp, but only in places where I know other people are nearby. I carry more protection now, and I'm more cautious. The woods are still beautiful, but they aren't the same. That night taught me that sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't the dark, or animals, or getting lost. It's the people you don't see, the ones who know you're there when you don't know they're watching. And when I think about it now, the thing that keeps me awake isn't the memory of hearing footsteps. It's knowing that at some point in the night, while I was asleep in that thin nylon tent, someone was standing only a few feet away from me. I had been planning the trip for months. It was supposed to be simple. Just me, a tent, a few days of quiet in the woods, and no one around to bother me. I picked a forest that stretched for miles, a place with plenty of remote spots where I wouldn't hear cars, see other hikers, or feel the pressure of city life. The thought of being completely alone out there made me excited. I wanted that feeling of freedom, of being cut off from everything. I packed carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food, stove, extra clothes, first aid kit, knife, flashlight, extra batteries, and a few small comforts. Everything fit into my backpack. The day I left was calm and cool. The sky was partly cloudy, but the forecast promised clear nights. I parked my car at the small dirt lot where the trail started. It was early afternoon, and there were only 2 other cars there. That meant I wasn't completely alone, but I figured most people stuck to the main trails and camped in designated spots. My plan was to head in deeper, far enough that I wouldn't run into anyone. The trail was narrow, lined with tall pines that seemed endless. Their needles softened the ground, so my footsteps were nearly silent. The air smelled of sap and damp earth. I walked for hours, only stopping to sip water and adjust my pack. Eventually, I spotted a clearing just off the trail. It was flat and wide enough for my tent, with a small fire ring someone had made long ago out of stones. No sign of recent use. It felt private, like no one had been there in years. That's where I decided to set up. I dropped my pack and stretched my back. Then I got to work. The tent went up easily. I rolled out my sleeping bag inside and stacked my gear in one corner. By the time I was done, the sun was starting to dip, and the air grew cooler. I gathered sticks and branches, breaking them into smaller pieces until I had enough for a small fire. I lit it with a match and sat back, watching the flames eat away at the wood. The crackling sound was comforting. Dinner was simple: boiled noodles, a bit of canned meat, and some trail mix. As I ate, the forest around me shifted. Day sounds faded, and night sounds rose. The buzzing of insects, the faint hoot of an owl, the rustle of something moving through the brush far off. I was used to these sounds, but when you're alone, they always feel sharper. Every snap of a twig makes you look up. Every gust of wind feels like footsteps. I stayed by the fire until the stars filled the sky. The flames cast shifting shadows across the trees, making them look like they were moving. I told myself it was nothing, just the firelight playing tricks. Around midnight, I put out the fire and went into my tent. The ground was firm under my sleeping bag, but I was tired enough to fall asleep quickly. I woke to a sound. It was faint at first, a crunch in the leaves somewhere nearby. I froze, listening. My first thought was that it was an animal. Deer, maybe. The forest was full of them. But then I heard it again, closer. Slow, steady steps moving through the clearing. Not a deer. Too heavy. Too controlled. My pulse quickened. I didn't move. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the roof of the tent. The steps circled, then stopped. I could hear breathing. Not the heavy snort of an animal, but slow human breaths. I felt my stomach drop. Someone was out there. I reached for my knife, which I had left near the sleeping bag. My hand found the handle and I held it tight. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't move. I just listened. The breathing went on for what felt like forever. Then slowly it faded. The steps moved away into the trees. I stayed awake for hours, clutching the knife until my hand ached. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. The next morning, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The clearing looked normal at first. Then I noticed the ground. There were prints in the dirt and pine needles. Boots. The tread was clear. Someone had walked around my tent in a slow circle. My chest tightened as I realized I hadn't imagined it. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was just another camper who got lost or curious. Maybe they saw my fire the night before and wandered over. Still, the fact that they didn't say anything, didn't call out, didn't do anything except breathe and walk in circles, that wasn't right. I ate a quick breakfast, packed a small day bag, and left the tent behind to hike further down the trail. I needed to clear my head. The forest was quiet again, and for a while I convinced myself it was nothing. Just bad luck, some hiker passing by at night. But as I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be watching me. After a few hours, I turned back. When I reached the clearing, the tent was just as I'd left it. But something was off. My gear inside the tent had been moved. Not taken, just shifted slightly. The sleeping bag was unrolled at a different angle. My backpack was leaning against the wrong side. Someone had gone inside while I was gone. My throat went dry. I checked my pack carefully. Everything was still there. Food, stove, first aid kit, flashlight. Nothing missing. Whoever it was didn't want my stuff. They wanted me to know they'd been there. I thought about leaving right then, packing up and hiking back to the car. But it was late afternoon already, and the lot was several hours away. Hiking in the dark didn't feel safe either. I decided to stay one more night and leave first thing in the morning. That evening, I skipped the fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I sat in the dark, eating cold food, listening to the forest. Every sound made my muscles tense. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees. Branches creaked. Somewhere far off, I heard a coyote. I stayed awake as long as I could, then finally crawled into the tent. Sleep didn't come easy. I lay there, knife in hand, eyes half shut. Hours passed. Then I heard it again. The steps. Slow, deliberate, moving through the clearing. I gripped the knife tighter, heart hammering in my chest. This time, the steps stopped right outside the tent. I could see the shadow of feet against the thin fabric. Motionless, just standing there. My breath came in shallow bursts. The shadow didn't move for minutes. Then, without a sound, it vanished. I waited, my ears strained. The forest was silent. I didn't sleep again that night. When dawn finally came, I tore down the tent in record time, shoving everything into my pack. My hands shook as I worked. I just wanted out. I hit the trail, moving fast, barely stopping for water. But halfway back, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the dirt of the trail, over my boot prints from yesterday were fresh ones. Heavier, deeper, following mine, all the way from the clearing. Someone had been tracking me. I pushed myself harder, legs burning. The trail twisted and turned, but I didn't stop to rest. Every time I looked back, I half expected to see someone there. The woods seemed too quiet, like they were holding their breath. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one left. The other vehicles were gone. I threw my pack inside, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands were trembling so badly I dropped the keys. When I finally started the engine, I peeled out of there, gravel spraying behind me. Only when I hit the highway did I start to breathe normally again. But even then, I kept checking my mirrors, convinced I'd see a car following me. I never went back to that forest. I don't camp alone anymore. To this day, I wonder who that was. A hiker playing games? Someone who lived out there, waiting for people like me to wander too far from safety? I'll never know. But I know this much. They weren't there by accident. They wanted me to know I wasn't alone. And that thought still keeps me up at night. I always thought camping was supposed to be peaceful, the kind of thing people did to escape the noise of everyday life. That was what I had in mind when I packed up my gear and decided to take a solo trip into the woods one summer. I didn't think much could go wrong as long as I had food, water, a tent, and some common sense. I had camped before, though never alone for more than a night. This time, I wanted to push myself a little further. I chose a spot near a lake, about 2 hours away from the nearest small town. The road leading there turned from pavement into gravel, then into dirt. By the time I pulled my car over and stepped out, there were no other people around. Just trees, a long stretch of trail, and the sound of birds echoing through the woods. I had planned to hike about 5 miles in with my backpack and set up near the water. I figured the lake would be a good landmark and give me a source for filtering water. The air was warm, the sky clear, and the trail looked easy enough. The first mile was uneventful. I walked at a steady pace, listening to the crunch of dirt under my boots. My pack weighed more than I expected, but it was manageable. The deeper I went, the quieter the world became. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was sliding lower in the sky. The water shimmered orange as the light reflected off it. I found a spot with flat ground surrounded by tall pines. It looked perfect, so I dropped my pack and started setting up my tent. I staked it down, rolled out my sleeping bag, and organized my food in a bear canister that I carried away from camp. Everything was routine. Everything felt normal. The first night passed without trouble. I sat by a small fire I built, listening to the sound of insects and the occasional splash of a fish in the lake. When darkness fell, I climbed into my tent and slept deeply. The second day, I hiked around the lake, just exploring. I saw deer tracks in the mud and a few fallen trees that looked like they had been ripped down by storms. I didn't see another person the entire time. Felt like I had the world to myself. That day, I cooked a simple meal on my stove, wrote in a small notebook I brought, and went to sleep early. It was the third night when things began to change. I woke up sometime after midnight. At first, I wasn't sure why. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. I lay still in my sleeping bag, listening. That was when I heard it. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. They weren't close, but they weren't far either. My first thought was that it might be an animal, maybe a deer or even a bear. I held my breath and waited, straining to hear. The steps came again, slow and deliberate. One after another. My heartbeat picked up. Deer usually move quickly, and bears don't sound like that either. This was different. The steps paused for several seconds, then started again, closer this time. I told myself it was just my imagination, that sounds in the woods can play tricks on you at night. I tried to roll over and go back to sleep, but I couldn't. The sounds circled around the area of my camp, stopping and starting as if whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be heard. Eventually, after what felt like hours, the noise faded. I forced myself to lie still until exhaustion pulled me back into sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside my tent, scanning the ground. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Then, a little farther from camp, I noticed impressions in the dirt. They weren't boot prints exactly, but they weren't made by animals either. They looked like bare feet. The toes had pressed into the soil, and the length of them was longer than mine. A chill went through me. I told myself it could be anything. Maybe some other camper had wandered by during the night, though the chances seemed slim in such a remote area. I pushed the thought out of my mind and spent the day trying to distract myself with fishing along the lake. Still, every time the wind rustled through the trees, I couldn't help but glance around. looking for movement. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing faint noises outside my tent, but I told myself not to overthink it. I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe slowly. On the 5th day, I decided I'd had enough of camping alone. The unease that had been building inside me was too much. I wanted to head back to my car and drive home. I packed up most of my gear that morning, but when I reached for my bear canister, it was gone. I searched the immediate area, thinking maybe I'd placed it farther away than I remembered, but it wasn't there. I walked in wider circles, scanning the ground. After 20 minutes, I found it lying near a fallen log, scratched and dirty. The lid had been forced open, and most of my food was gone. What bothered me most was that the canister hadn't been dragged the way a bear might drag it. It looked like it had been carried. That was the moment I realized I wasn't alone out here. I packed the rest of my gear as fast as I could. I didn't even care about leaving behind small items. My only thought was getting out. With my pack on my shoulders, I started back toward the trail. The woods felt different now. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every sound made me tense. By late afternoon, I realized I had made a mistake. In my rush to leave, I had gone the wrong way. The trail beneath my feet didn't look familiar. I tried to retrace my steps, but the deeper I went, the less sure I became of where I was. Panic set in. I tried to calm myself by stopping, sitting on a rock, and drinking some water. I took out my map, but without clear landmarks, it didn't help much. I decided to keep moving, hoping I'd eventually reconnect with the trail. The forest grew darker as evening approached. I hadn't found the path, and I didn't want to keep stumbling around in the dark. I picked a spot against a cluster of trees and set my tent back up, though I left no fire burning. The idea of light drawing attention made me nervous. That night, the noises returned. The steps came again, closer than before. I could hear twigs snapping, leaves crunching. My heart hammered inside my chest. I gripped the small knife I kept in my pack, though it didn't make me feel any safer. At one point, I heard the sound of breathing. Slow, steady, human breathing, just beyond the thin wall of my tent. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag, every muscle tense. After what felt like forever, the sound moved away. I lay awake until the first light of dawn finally appeared. The next day, I was exhausted. My body ached from lack of sleep, and my nerves were shot. I forced myself to keep walking, choosing a direction that I thought would eventually lead me back. I had very little food left, only a couple of protein bars and some trail mix at the bottom of my pack. Hours passed. The woods seemed endless. Around midday, I stopped to rest. That was when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Hanging from a tree branch a few feet above the ground was a piece of fabric. I walked closer. It was part of my shirt, the extra one I had packed away. The sleeve had been ripped clean off. I didn't know how it got there. I hadn't lost it. Someone had taken it. Someone was following me. My skin crawled. I looked around in every direction, but the forest was still, quiet. I pushed myself to keep going. That night, I didn't set up the tent. I thought maybe it would be better to sleep hidden. So I curled beneath a fallen tree and covered myself with leaves and my sleeping bag. I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing faint whistles in the distance. They weren't bird calls. They were deliberate, high-pitched sounds followed by lower ones. Whoever was out there knew I was here. By the 7th day, I was desperate. My water was running low, and my legs felt weak. I stumbled more than walked. Every so often, I thought I caught glimpses of movement through the trees. A figure ducking out of sight, the flash of pale skin. I never got a clear look. I started marking trees with my knife as I passed them, small notches in the bark, just to keep track of where I'd been. By afternoon, I circled back and found one of my own marks, but it had been carved deeper, wider, as if someone had come behind me and retraced my steps. I can't describe the feeling that went through me. My chest tightened, and I could barely breathe. That night, I didn't bother trying to sleep. I sat with my knife in my hand, staring into the dark. The woods stayed silent, but I knew someone was there, watching. It wasn't until the 9th day that I finally stumbled onto a dirt road. I don't remember much about how I got there. My mind was hazy, and my body was weak. I just remember breaking through the trees and seeing tire tracks in the soil. Relief flooded through me so hard that I almost cried. I followed the road for what felt like hours until I saw a parked truck in the distance. I had never been so happy to see another sign of people. I kept moving until I reached the edge of town later that evening. I never saw who was out there with me. I never knew if it was one person or more or what they wanted. All I know is that someone followed me for days in those woods, took my food, left signs for me to find, and never showed themselves. I never went camping alone again. I had been looking forward to a quiet camping trip for weeks. My work had been grinding me down, and I felt like I hadn't had a moment of real silence in months. The thought of getting away from everything, the noise of traffic, the constant buzzing of my phone, the small talk I couldn't escape, was the only thing keeping me sane. I picked a spot in a forest about 4 hours from home. It wasn't the kind of place packed with campers or RVs. This was deep woods, and that was exactly what I wanted. I wanted to hear nothing but the wind through the trees and the crackling of a fire. I left early in the morning, my car loaded with everything I thought I might need. I had a tent, a sleeping bag, extra clothes, a small propane stove, plenty of food, water jugs, a first aid kit, and a hatchet. I even brought along a folding camp chair because I didn't want to spend the whole trip sitting on logs or the ground. The drive itself was peaceful. The highway eventually turned into smaller 2-lane roads, and those turned into narrow gravel paths that wound their way through endless trees. The farther I got from town, the quieter everything became. When I finally reached the little pull-off that served as parking for the trail, there was only one other vehicle there. It was an old beat-up pickup truck that looked like it hadn't moved in weeks. The windows were coated with dust, and the bed was filled with random junk. It didn't bother me much, but I made a mental note of it. Out here, you notice things like that. I strapped on my backpack, slung the rest of my gear over my shoulder, and started walking down the narrow dirt trail. It was only supposed to be about 2 miles to the spot I had picked out near a small river bend. The air smelled clean, sharp with pine and damp earth. My boots crunched over fallen leaves and broken twigs. Every now and then, a squirrel darted across the path, stopping to chatter at me before vanishing into the undergrowth. When I reached the clearing by the river, I felt good about my choice. The water moved slow and steady, making a soft rushing sound as it slipped over rocks. The clearing itself was flat enough to pitch a tent, and there were plenty of downed branches nearby for a fire. I set down my gear, stretched, and got to work. I pitched my tent near the tree-line so it would be a little shielded from the wind. Then I laid out my sleeping bag inside, organized my food in a bear-proof container, and set up the little folding chair by the fire ring I built out of rocks. By the time everything was in place, I was sweating and covered in dirt, but I felt satisfied. The site looked like a real camp. The first day went by easily. I hiked a little along the river, took my time cooking a simple meal on the stove, and watched the sun go down. The sky went from gold to purple to black, and soon the stars came out in huge numbers. They seemed so much brighter out here without the glow of city lights. I sat by the fire, listening to the crackle of wood, and for the first time in a long time, I felt calm. But the calm didn't last. It started with small things. The first night, sometime around midnight, I woke up in my tent to the sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, probably a raccoon nosing around, or maybe a deer passing by. But the sound wasn't quite right. It wasn't quick, scurrying steps. It was slow, heavy, like something walking on 2 feet. I held my breath, lying perfectly still, and listened. The steps moved close to my tent. I could hear them on the dry leaves. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. I waited for them to move on, but they lingered near the tent, circling slowly, then stopping. My heart pounded so hard I was sure whatever it was could hear it. I didn't unzip the tent, didn't make a sound. After what felt like forever, the footsteps finally moved off into the woods. I barely slept the rest of the night. My mind kept playing tricks on me, imagining shadows moving just outside the thin nylon walls. When morning came, I stumbled out of the tent, exhausted but relieved to see the sunlight. I checked the ground around my campsite. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, but then, in the dirt near the edge of the clearing, I saw impressions. Footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine. They were bare. No shoes, no boots, just the shape of feet pressed into the damp soil. They circled part of the camp and then disappeared into the woods. I tried to tell myself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe someone from the area liked to walk barefoot. Maybe they were fishing along the river and wandered by. But the prints weren't fresh. They were from the night before. Whoever it was, they had been standing close enough to see my tent. The rest of the day, I tried to distract myself with fishing. I sat by the river with my line in the water, listening to birds and the hum of insects, but my mind kept drifting back to those prints. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. When night came again, I built the fire higher than before. I sat with my back to the tent so I could see the tree lean, my hatchet leaning against the chair within reach. The woods seemed darker that night. Every sound felt sharper. The wind rattling the branches sounded too much like movement. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, just outside the glow of the fire. I froze, my eyes darting to the shadows. The steps circled again, moving around the perimeter of the light, just far enough back that I couldn't see anything clearly. I gripped the handle of the hatchet so tight my hand ached. For hours, the sounds came and went. Sometimes it was footsteps. Sometimes it was the snap of a branch under weight. At one point, I thought I saw a figure between the trees, just a darker patch of shadow against the rest, standing perfectly still. I blinked, and it was gone. When morning came, I found more footprints. Again, barefoot. They came close to the fire pit, then stopped. Whoever it was, they had stood there, just watching me sit by the fire. By the third day, I was on edge. I barely ate. I walked the perimeter of the camp, checking the ground, scanning the trees. The forest no longer felt peaceful. Felt like it was closing in on me. I thought about packing up and leaving, but a part of me wanted to believe I was just overreacting. Maybe it was all in my head. That night settled it. I tried to force myself to sleep in the tent, but my body wouldn't relax. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. Sometime around 2 a.m., I heard a sound that froze me in place. The zipper of my tent. It moved just a little. Slow, careful. Someone was testing it. I shot upright, grabbed the hatchet, and shouted as loud as I could. The sound outside stopped instantly. For a long moment, there was silence. Then I heard fast footsteps, crashing into the woods, moving away from the camp. I didn't sleep at all after that. I sat by the fire until dawn, clutching the hatchet, staring into the trees. My nerves were shredded. When the first light broke, I packed everything as fast as I could, shoving gear into my pack without caring about order. I doused the fire, slung the bag over my shoulder, and started down the trail back to the car. The walk back felt 10 times longer than when I arrived. Every sound made me spin around. Every rustle in the brush felt like footsteps behind me. My heart didn't stop racing until I finally saw the parking lot ahead through the trees. But when I stepped into the clearing, my stomach dropped. My car was there, but so was the old beat-up pickup truck. The one I had seen when I first arrived. Only now it wasn't coated in dust. The windows were clean. The truck bed was empty. Fresh tire marks cut into the dirt around it. Someone had been here the whole time, watching, following. I didn't waste another second. I threw my gear in the car, locked the doors, and sped out of there, gravel spraying under my tires. I didn't look back until I hit the main road miles away. By the time I made it home, the exhaustion finally hit me. I collapsed into bed, still smelling like smoke and dirt, and slept for nearly a full day. But even then, the unease didn't leave me. I kept thinking about the footprints circling my camp, the sound of the zipper in the middle of the night, the truck that suddenly wasn't abandoned anymore. It wasn't animals. It wasn't my imagination. Someone had been there, and they had gotten far too close. I had always enjoyed camping, but I usually stuck to familiar places. This time, I wanted something different. I wanted to test myself by going to a more remote area, far away from crowded campgrounds, and spend a few days completely alone. I told myself it would be peaceful, a way to disconnect from everything and really experience nature without distraction. I prepared for weeks, reading maps, checking weather forecasts, and packing every item I thought I might need. My backpack was heavy but balanced, full of food, water filters, a sleeping bag, a small tent, extra clothing, and a basic first aid kit. I had a small hatchet, a knife, and a can of bear spray just in case. The area I chose was in the mountains, miles from the nearest town. I parked my car on the side of a gravel road, shouldered my pack, and followed an old trail that looked barely used. The air was cool, the sky gray, and the woods were quiet in that heavy way that makes every step sound louder than it should. The trees were tall and close together, the ground uneven with roots and rocks, and I could feel how cut off from everything I was with every mile I hiked. The first day went smoothly. I found a clearing near a small stream where I could get water, and I set up my tent there. I gathered wood, built a small fire, and cooked some simple food. The air smelled of pine and damp soil, and for a while I felt good about my choice. It was quiet, but the kind of quiet that felt calm. I watched the fire burn down until only red coals remained, then climbed into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes. The first night was uneventful. I woke once to the sound of an owl and once more to the wind pushing through the trees, but nothing alarming. I packed up the next morning and hiked further, wanting to explore deeper before circling back in a few days. By the second night, I had reached a ridge with a view of the valley below. I set up camp just off the ridge line, tucked between some rocks and trees where the wind wouldn't be too strong. I ate, stretched out, and listened to the distant sounds of the forest as darkness covered everything. Again, nothing unusual happened, and I started to think the whole trip would be as smooth as the first 2 days. It wasn't until the third day that I began to feel uneasy. I had left camp that morning with only a light pack to scout the area. The trail was faint and hard to follow, and after hours of walking I realized I had lost track of where I had come from. I stopped often to check my map and compass, but the woods all looked the same: thick, green, endless. I finally decided to turn back, following the general direction I thought would lead me to camp. My chest felt tight with unease, but I kept moving. By the time I finally found my tent again, the sun was dipping low. My legs were tired, my throat dry, and my nerves on edge. I cooked something quickly and sat close to the fire, staring into the flames longer than usual. The quiet felt heavier that night, like the trees were pressing in on me. I heard twigs snapping in the darkness more often than before, though whenever I shined my light, nothing was there. I told myself it was just animals, deer moving through the woods, maybe raccoons, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different now, that I wasn't alone the way I thought I had been before. I crawled into my tent, zipped it closed, and lay in my bag with my ears straining. Every sound seemed louder. I didn't sleep much. The next morning I decided I should cut the trip short and start making my way back toward the car. I packed quickly, feeling a kind of nervous energy in my chest. I followed my compass carefully, retracing as best I could. The trail was harder to follow than I remembered, and at times I felt certain I had wandered off again. Around midday, I came across something that made my stomach sink. In the dirt, not far from where I walked, were footprints. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, and they led roughly in the same direction I had come from. The prints looked fresh, the edges sharp, the soil still dark from where it had been pressed. I froze, staring at them. I was miles from any town, and this wasn't an area with popular trails. I hadn't seen a single person since I left my car days ago. Seeing those footprints made my skin crawl. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe a hunter passing through, but I couldn't ignore the fact that they seemed recent. I kept walking, trying not to think about it, but now every sound in the woods seemed sharper. The crunch of leaves under my boots felt like it carried forever. The woods were too quiet, as if they were holding their breath. By late afternoon, I stopped to rest and drink from my water filter. As I crouched near the stream, I noticed something else that set me on edge. On a rock nearby, there were fresh marks. like someone had struck it with a blade. The cuts were sharp, long, and out of place. I stared at them for a long time, feeling my throat tighten. I moved on quickly after that, not wanting to linger. The sky grew darker with clouds, and the air cooled. I decided to set up camp earlier than usual, needing rest but also wanting light to work by. I pitched my tent in a small hollow, lit a fire, and tried to calm down. But the unease only grew. That night was the worst so far. I had just settled into my sleeping bag when I heard it. At first it was faint, almost like the wind, but then clearer. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the leaves outside my camp. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The steps circled, pausing now and then continued. I lay frozen, every muscle tight. I didn't move, didn't breathe too loud, just listened. The steps faded, but I couldn't tell how far they went. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the thin fabric of my tent, certain that at any moment it would be unzipped from the outside. At some point, exhaustion must have taken me because I woke with a start to the gray light of dawn. My fire was long out, and everything was quiet again. But when I stepped outside, I saw them. More footprints, in the dirt around my tent, circling it, stopping only a few feet from where I had slept. My stomach dropped, and my hands shook. Whoever it was had come into my camp in the night and walked around while I lay inside, too afraid to move. I packed as fast as I could, barely eating. I didn't even bother with a fire. I just needed to move to put distance between me and whoever had been there. I followed my compass and moved quickly, my head constantly turning, scanning the trees. The day dragged on endlessly. My pack felt heavier, my legs weaker, but I didn't dare stop for long. Every time I paused to catch my breath, I thought I heard something behind me. A branch snapping, leaves shifting. Always distant, always just far enough that I couldn't see. By late afternoon, I was desperate for rest. I found a small rise with a clear view of the slope below and decided to camp there, thinking it would be safer if I could see something approaching. I gathered wood, built a small fire, and tried to steady my nerves. But as the darkness fell, my fear grew worse. The forest was alive with sounds, but they didn't feel natural anymore. Twigs broke too often, heavy steps crunched too close. At one point I swore I heard breathing, slow and steady, just beyond the fire's reach. I sat with my hatchet in one hand and the bear spray in the other, my eyes locked on the shadows. I stayed awake all night, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. When dawn finally came, I felt half dead already, but I forced myself up and kept moving. The forest seemed endless. My compass told me I was headed in the right direction, but the terrain twisted and shifted, making every step a fight. My feet were blistered, my shoulders sore, my throat raw, but fear kept me going. Couldn't stop. Near midday, I saw something that confirmed my worst fear. In a patch of soft dirt ahead, there were more footprints, fresh again. Whoever it was, they were still behind me, following. They were not just passing through. They were tracking me. The realization nearly broke me. My chest tightened, my hands shook, and for a moment I wanted to collapse right there. But I forced myself forward, pushing harder, sweat soaking my clothes. That night, I didn't dare build a fire. I pitched my tent in a low spot under heavy trees, hoping the cover would hide me. I sat in the dark with no light, listening to every sound. Hours dragged by like days. My body ached, my eyes burned, and still I listened. Sometime past midnight, I heard them again. Slow, careful steps, this time closer. They moved around me, circling, stopping now and then. My chest felt like it would burst. I gripped the hatchet so hard my hand hurt. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and fast. The steps stopped for a long time, then slowly faded into the distance. I stayed frozen, unable to sleep, until the first faint light appeared. When I stepped outside my tent, I saw it. A small object stuck into the ground just a few feet away. A piece of wood, sharpened to a point, standing upright like a marker. It hadn't been there the night before. My mouth went dry, my stomach twisting. Whoever was following me wasn't just tracking me. They were leaving signs, warnings, maybe even I had been waiting for weeks to get away from everything and spend a few days out in the woods. My job had been draining me. The city noise never stopped, and I felt like my head was always buzzing. I wanted silence, the kind of silence that only deep woods could give. I wanted to hear the wind move through tall trees, the sound of running water far away, the soft crackle of a fire, and nothing else. I planned the trip carefully, bought what I needed, and marked out a spot on the map that was far enough from the usual campgrounds so I wouldn't be bothered by other people. I picked a stretch of forest I had only been to once before. It was a big state forest, not a park with campsites and rangers checking on you, but just endless woods with old logging roads and hidden clearings. The kind of place where, if something went wrong, you would be on your own until you managed to get back to the nearest road. That was part of the appeal. I wanted to test myself and see how it felt to spend time alone out there with no phone service, no other voices, nothing but nature and whatever I carried on my back. I drove out early in the morning and parked my truck on the edge of a dirt pull-off where an old trail disappeared into the trees. The sky was clear, the air was cool, and I felt good. I shouldered my pack and started walking. The first mile or so was easy. The trail was wide, though uneven, and it slowly carried me deeper into the pines. I could hear birds and the faint rush of water in the distance. After a while, the path narrowed, roots sticking up like knotted ropes, and I had to watch my step. I pushed on for a couple of hours, stopping once to sip water, and finally reached the clearing I had seen on the map. The spot was perfect, a circle of flat ground surrounded by tall trees, with enough space for a small fire and my tent. Not far away was a creek, which meant I had water as long as I boiled or filtered it. I dropped my pack and just stood there for a minute, breathing in the clean air and looking around. It felt far away from everything I had left behind. I set up camp slowly, making sure to do everything right. I pitched my small tent, staked it down, and spread my sleeping bag inside. I cleared a safe spot for a fire, ringed it with rocks, and gathered wood. The sun was still high when I finished, so I sat for a while and ate a simple meal. The quiet was deep but not empty. I could hear the wind moving high in the trees and the water over stones. A few squirrels chattered somewhere behind me, and now and then a bird cried out. It was the kind of noise that made you feel like you weren't alone, but not in a bad way. As the day went on, I walked to the creek and filled my bottle. The water was cold and clear, but I still ran it through my filter. I carried some back to camp and cooked dinner over the fire. The light started to fade. I sat on a log, poking at the flames, watching the woods turn darker. One thing about being out there alone was that the shadows stretched differently. Every sound felt sharper. I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to it, that my brain was wired to stay alert when I wasn't in familiar surroundings. When it got fully dark, the fire became the only light around me. Beyond the glow, the woods were pitch black. I could hear things moving out there, probably small animals, maybe deer. I tried not to let my mind wander, but it was hard not to picture shapes out in the dark, standing just beyond where I could see. I finally crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. Inside, it felt safer, even though I knew a thin layer of nylon wouldn't stop much if something bigger came along. The night was long. I woke up several times, unsure if I had heard something or if it was just the forest. Once I thought I heard a branch snap close by, but when I held still and listened, there was nothing but the usual rustling. I drifted back to sleep eventually. The next day was better. Sunlight pushed through the tent, and the woods looked friendly again. I made breakfast, packed a smaller bag, and decided to follow the creek upstream. It wound through thick woods and opened up into little clearings where the sun fell on mossy rocks. I walked for hours, taking my time, enjoying the air and the sound of water. At one point, I saw fresh tracks in the mud along the bank. They were boot prints, not animal. That caught me off guard. I hadn't expected to see signs of anyone else out there. The prints looked fairly new, pressed deep into the mud, and there were more than one set. 2 people at least, maybe 3. They were headed the same way I was going. I stood there for a long time, looking at them, feeling the quiet pressing in. I told myself maybe hunters, maybe hikers, but I hadn't passed a single car when I parked. Still, people did come out here sometimes. It wasn't impossible. I pushed the thought away and kept going, but I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often. When I got back to camp, the first thing I noticed was that my firewood pile had been moved. I had stacked it carefully before leaving, but now the pieces were scattered. Not gone, not burned, just shifted. My pack was where I left it, the tent untouched. Maybe an animal had knocked into the pile. That made sense. I didn't like the way it looked, though. That night, I tried to sleep but kept thinking about the boot prints and the scattered wood. Every sound outside seemed louder. At one point, I heard something close to my tent, slow steps in the pine needles. I held my breath, listening, heart pounding. The steps stopped. I lay there for what felt like forever. Finally, I forced myself to unzip the flap just an inch and peek out. The fire had burned down to embers, and beyond that there was nothing but darkness. I didn't see anyone. I zipped the tent shut and stayed awake a long time, waiting before I finally dozed off. The third day, I decided not to wander far. I stayed near camp, gathered more wood, and tried to relax. The quiet was heavy. It felt different now, like the woods were watching me. Midday, I found something that made the hair on my arms stand up. Down near the creek, close to where I had filled water the day before, there was a small pile of stones stacked into a neat tower. It hadn't been there yesterday. Someone had built it, and it wasn't me. I walked back to camp fast, trying not to look like I was running. My mind was racing. If someone else was out there, they knew where I was. Maybe they had passed through, maybe they were still close. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just another camper marking a spot, but deep down I knew it was meant to be seen. That night was the worst. I barely slept. I heard movement around my tent more than once, faint but steady, like someone circling. I didn't open the flap this time. I just lay there, clutching my knife, listening to my own breathing and the faint crunch of pine needles outside. Eventually, the sounds faded, but I never really fell asleep. In the morning, I made up my mind to leave. I packed quickly, not even bothering with breakfast. The woods felt wrong now, like they had swallowed me up. I doused the fire, shouldered my pack, and started down the trail. Not long after, I saw more boot prints on the path. Fresh, headed the same direction I was going. The ground was soft enough that they looked new, like they had been made early that morning or the night before. My stomach dropped. Whoever had been around my camp had walked this way too. I kept moving faster than before. Every so often I stopped and listened. The woods were silent except for my own steps and the pounding of my heart. But once, when I paused, I thought I heard another step behind me, far back but steady. I didn't look. I just kept walking. Hours passed. My legs ached. My throat was dry, but I didn't stop. Finally, I saw the thin strip of road through the trees. Relief hit me hard. I stepped out of the woods and saw my truck still there, right where I left it. I threw my pack in the back and climbed in. As I started the engine, I glanced once more at the tree line. For a second, I thought I saw movement, a shape between the trunks, standing still and watching. Then it was gone. Maybe my eyes were just playing tricks on me, but I didn't wait to find out. I pulled onto the dirt road and drove until the forest was nothing but a line in the mirror. When I got home, the quiet of the woods still clung to me, but not in the way I had wanted. It wasn't peace anymore. It was the heavy memory of being watched, of knowing someone else had been out there in the dark with me. I never went back to that forest again. I had been looking forward to that camping trip for weeks. I had spent most of my time indoors lately, stuck at work and at home, staring at screens and walls, and I wanted something that would push me out into the real world again. I thought that sleeping under the stars, away from traffic, phones, and noise, would give me the kind of reset I needed. I packed my tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, canned food, and some gear into the back of my car. I didn't want anything fancy or complicated. Just me, my backpack, and enough supplies for a few nights in the woods. The drive to the area was long. It was about 4 hours away from the city, and the roads grew smaller and rougher the further I went. Eventually, I was driving along narrow roads surrounded by endless pine trees and patches of bare ground. The area I had chosen wasn't one of those popular, family-friendly campgrounds. I wanted quiet, so I went for a more remote spot near a lake. I had found it on a map and read about it in a small forum where people shared camping spots. It was marked as being quiet and less visited, which sounded perfect to me. By the time I reached the gravel road leading toward the lake, it was late afternoon. The sun was still out but starting to sink lower, casting a warm light through the trees. I parked at a small clearing that seemed like an informal spot for campers. The ground was flat, and there was a faint fire ring made of stones. I unpacked my gear and carried it down a narrow trail that led toward the water. The trail was surrounded by thick woods. The trees grew close together, and the ground was covered with dead leaves, pine needles, and fallen branches. Every step made a crunching sound. I could hear the lake before I saw it, the faint lapping of water against the shore. When the trail opened up, I stepped out into a small clearing right by the lake's edge. The water was calm, dark, and reflective. On the opposite shore, I saw nothing but more trees stretching for miles. It felt like the place was cut off from everything else, and I liked that. I set up my tent near the tree line, not too close to the water but close enough that I could hear it at night. The air smelled clean, a mix of pine and damp soil. I boiled some water on my little stove and made instant noodles. I ate sitting on a flat rock, staring out at the water as the sun dipped lower. By the time the sky turned orange and then purple, I had cleaned up, put my food away, and crawled into my tent. The first night was quiet. I heard the usual forest sounds, crickets, the occasional splash from the water, and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I fell asleep quickly, tired from the drive and the setup. The next morning, I woke to a thin mist hanging over the lake. The air was cold, and I could see my breath. I made some coffee and oatmeal, then walked along the shoreline to explore. The ground was damp, and my boots left prints in the mud. I saw old footprints too, some deeper than mine, maybe from someone who had been there before me. They looked like they had been there a while, washed a little by rain, so I didn't think much of it. I spent the day hiking. The trail wound deeper into the woods, uphill in some parts, with rocks and roots jutting out. I didn't see anyone else. It was just me, the trees, and the constant sound of birds. After a few hours, I turned back toward camp, sweaty and tired. When I returned, I noticed something strange. My backpack, which I had left zipped shut near my tent, was slightly open. The zipper was pulled halfway down. At first, I thought maybe I had left it like that, but when I checked inside, a few things looked moved around. My flashlight wasn't where I had placed it, and one of my food bags was lying on its side. Nothing was missing, though. Maybe a raccoon had gotten into it, I thought, though the zipper being pulled down neatly seemed odd. I shrugged it off and made myself dinner. That night, I stayed awake longer, sitting near a small fire I had made. The woods around me felt darker than before. The firelight only reached a small circle, and beyond that was pitch black. I heard noises, twigs snapping, distant rustles, that made me glance over my shoulder more than once. Still, I told myself it was just animals. Eventually, I put out the fire and went to bed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know why. Then I realized I had heard something. A sharp sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I lay still, holding my breath, listening. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, not the quick scamper of an animal. It seemed to be moving around near the edge of my camp. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only minutes. Finally, the sound faded away. I told myself it was my imagination or maybe a deer wandering close. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside my tent and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place at first. Then I noticed something in the dirt a few feet from my tent. A footprint. It wasn't mine. I checked by pressing my boot into the ground next to it. Mine were wider and had a different tread. This one was narrower and looked more worn down, like an old pair of shoes. I felt a chill run through me. I tried to stay calm, telling myself maybe someone had passed through during the night without realizing I was there. But deep down, I knew the print was fresh. The edges were sharp, not softened by wind or rain. Whoever had made it had been there not long ago. I debated leaving right then, but I convinced myself to stay. I had come all this way, and I didn't want to give up after just 2 nights. Still, the feeling of unease stayed with me the whole day. I hiked again but stuck closer to camp. I kept checking behind me as I walked, certain I was being watched. That evening, I decided not to build a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I sat in the dim light, eating cold food straight from the can, listening to every sound in the woods. The sun set, and the sky turned dark. I crawled into my tent earlier than usual, hoping to sleep off the nerves. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay there wide awake, staring at the faint outline of the tent ceiling above me. Then, just like the night before, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were slower, closer. They circled the tent, crunching softly on the ground. I could hear breathing too, faint but steady. My heart pounded so hard I thought whoever was out there would hear it. I wanted to yell, to scare them off, but my throat felt frozen. I gripped the handle of my knife inside my sleeping bag, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could see the faint shadow of something or someone through the fabric. They stood there for a long time, unmoving. Then, slowly, they walked away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep at all after that. I lay awake until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. As soon as it was bright enough, I stepped out and scanned the ground. More footprints, several of them circling my tent. That was enough for me. I packed everything quickly, shoving gear into my backpack without caring about order. I hiked back to my car with shaking legs, every sound in the woods making me flinch. When I reached the clearing where my car was parked, my stomach dropped. The driver's side door was slightly open. I knew I had locked it. I always checked twice. My hands trembled as I walked closer. The inside of the car was a mess. Glove box open, papers scattered, food wrappers tossed around. Someone had gone through everything. Luckily, nothing important seemed missing, but the fact that they had been inside my car was worse than losing anything. I didn't waste another second. I jumped in, slammed the door shut, and drove off, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't look back until I had reached the main road, and even then, I felt like I was being followed. The drive home was long, and my eyes kept flicking to the mirrors. Every car behind me made my chest tighten. I didn't relax until I pulled into my driveway hours later. That night, lying in my own bed, I realized how close I might have come to real danger. Someone had been out there watching me walking around my tent while I slept. They had gotten into my backpack, circled my camp, and even searched through my car. I had gone out there looking for peace and quiet, but instead, I had found something else, something far more unsettling. It wasn't the woods or the darkness that scared me. It was knowing that someone had chosen to come close, to watch me, and to let me know they were there. I never went back to that spot again. And now, whenever I camp, I pick busier places, even if they're noisy and crowded, because in the quiet, far away from anyone else, you don't always know who might be out there with you. I had been wanting to get away for a while. Life in the city had been nothing but noise, rushing cars, busy sidewalks, and the constant feeling that I could not hear my own thoughts. I wanted silence. I wanted to hear only the sounds of wind moving through trees, or water lapping against a shore, or a fire crackling at night. That was the whole reason I chose to go camping alone. I told myself it was just for a few days. Nothing dangerous, nothing reckless. Just me, a tent, some supplies, and a quiet patch of woods by a lake where I could breathe and feel small again. The drive out there was long, and the farther I went, the more I saw the land change from crowded streets to open stretches of green and brown. Trees grew taller the deeper I drove into the forest roads. The pavement ended after a while, turning into gravel that popped under my tires. I followed the directions I had written down, taking turns where signs leaned to the side or were barely visible under branches. Eventually, I found the place I was looking for, It was an area near an old trail that wasn't very popular anymore. The lake wasn't huge, but it was big enough to reflect the sky like a mirror. The shore had patches of sand and smooth stones, and behind it were layers of thick forest that went on for miles. I could see no one else there. No cars, no campers, just me. That was exactly what I wanted. I parked near a small clearing and started unloading. My backpack was heavy, packed with food, water, a cooking pot, and a few tools I might need. I had my tent rolled up tight, a sleeping bag, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a knife I kept for safety. I was careful about planning, and I made sure to bring enough to last a few nights without issue. I set up my tent close enough to the lake that I could hear the water moving, but far enough back from the shore that it felt sheltered. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the smell of the forest was stronger than anything I had smelled in months. I laid out my sleeping bag, tested the zipper on the tent door, and stacked some firewood I gathered nearby. That first evening felt perfect. The sun went down slowly, turning the sky orange, then pink, then a deep blue as the stars came out. I lit my fire and cooked a simple meal, just heating water and pouring it into one of those pre-packed camping meals. It tasted better than anything I had eaten in the city because it felt earned. Smoke drifted upward in a thin line. The air was still and cool. I thought I was going to sleep better than I had in years, and I did for that first night. The trouble started the next morning, though I didn't realize it was trouble at the time. I woke early, unzipped the tent, and stepped out into air that felt damp and fresh. The surface of the lake was smooth and shining. I stretched, walked down to the shore, and crouched to splash some water on my face. As I did, I noticed footprints in the wet sand. At first, I thought they might have been mine, but when I compared them to my own boots, I saw they were not the same. These were larger, flatter, and spaced farther apart, like someone heavier had walked through barefoot or with thin shoes. They came from the woods, went along the shore, and then disappeared back into the trees. I told myself it wasn't anything strange. Maybe someone else had passed by early in the morning, or maybe even the day before I arrived. The lake was open to anyone who knew about it, after all. I tried not to think too hard about it. The rest of the day went normally. I hiked a little, collected more firewood, and took time to just sit near the water. I watched fish break the surface and insects skim across it. Birds called from the trees, and now and then I heard something bigger move through the undergrowth deeper in the forest. Probably a deer, maybe a fox. That was part of the wild, and I wasn't afraid of it. When night came again, I made another fire, ate, and lay down in the tent. Took me a while to fall asleep. The woods sounded louder that night. Crickets filled the air with their rhythm, and the occasional crack of a branch breaking echoed in the dark. I reminded myself that forests are never truly silent. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to a sound. It wasn't an animal cry. It wasn't the rustle of leaves. It was the sound of steps. Slow, careful steps. They crunched lightly on pine needles, stopped, then moved again. My body went cold. I lay completely still in my sleeping bag, my ears straining. The sound circled my tent. One step, then another, then another. Whoever it was, they were close enough that I could hear their weight shift. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't even breathe deeply. I told myself it could be a deer sniffing around, but the steps were too steady, too deliberate. They didn't wander the way animals did. They moved like a person. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the steps drifted away. I waited in silence until I couldn't hear them anymore. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping my flashlight and knife inside the tent, listening for the sound to come back. Didn't. The next morning, I stepped outside and checked around. I half expected to see nothing, but the ground told me otherwise. The same kind of footprints I had seen by the lake were around my campsite now. They circled the tent, came close to the fire pit, then vanished back into the woods. That was when my stomach sank. This wasn't just someone passing through. Someone had been watching me while I slept. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just someone curious. Maybe it was a local person passing through. They hadn't done anything to me, Maybe they wouldn't come back. I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I couldn't relax. I spent that whole day with my nerves stretched tight. I kept checking the tree line. I walked a little farther from camp, but every time I did, I had the feeling that eyes were following me. The woods didn't feel calm anymore. They felt alive in a way that made me uneasy. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed up by the fire, feeding it more wood whenever it burned low. The flames kept the dark at bay, but I couldn't see beyond the first line of trees. Every crackle in the distance made my skin crawl. I sat with the knife close at hand, staring into the shadows until the first light of morning finally came. By then, I had made up my mind. I was going to leave. I packed slowly, trying not to panic. I rolled up my sleeping bag, stuffed my backpack, and took down the tent. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. I kept turning to check the woods, but I never saw anyone. Not directly, but just as I was about to haul my things to the car, I noticed something that made me freeze. On a tree not far from where I had been camping, a mark had been carved into the bark. It was deep and rough, like someone had used a knife to slash a symbol or just gouge lines into it. The mark hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. That was enough for me. I grabbed my gear and hurried back to the car. When I reached it, my heart nearly stopped. The driver's side door was open. I knew I had closed it. I knew I had locked it, but it was open now, hanging wide as if someone had been inside. I dropped my gear into the back seat, climbed in, and shut the door fast. My hands shook as I started the engine. The gas tank was still full. Nothing seemed stolen, but the seat felt wrong, like someone had adjusted it. I didn't linger to check. I just drove. Gravel sprayed behind my tires as I pulled onto the road. I didn't look in the mirrors. I didn't want to see anything in them. I drove until the trees thinned and the roads became smooth again. I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station miles away. I sat there in the lot, my chest tight, trying to calm myself down. When I finally worked up the nerve to check the car, I noticed small things. The glove compartment was open. My map had been pulled out and left unfolded. Nothing was missing, but it had been touched. Someone had been inside while I was asleep in that tent. I never went back to that lake again. I always thought camping was supposed to be a break from life, a way to clear the head and breathe in air that didn't smell like car exhaust or kitchen grease. That's why I decided to drive out alone one weekend and spend 3 nights in a small state forest that wasn't too far from home. It wasn't famous, not crowded, and that was the main reason I chose it. I wanted quiet. I wanted space. I didn't plan anything fancy. I packed a tent, a sleeping bag, a cooler, some food, water bottles, a headlamp, a couple of knives, a hatchet, and a cheap gas stove. I thought I'd hike during the day, maybe fish at the small lake nearby, then sit by a fire at night. Simple, quiet, and safe. At least that was what I told myself. The drive was smooth. I reached the entrance by noon, parked at the small gravel lot, and carried my gear down the path that led deeper into the trees. The forest wasn't thick at first. I could still see patches of sunlight hitting the ground between the trunks. Birds chirped, and insects buzzed, and I felt relaxed as soon as I walked far enough that the sound of cars faded away. I picked a flat spot near a slow creek. The ground was soft with pine needles, but not swampy. The creek wasn't deep, just knee-high at most, and the water ran clear over rocks. I figured it would be a good place to refill water if needed, as long as I boiled it. I set up my tent close enough to hear the running water, but far enough not to worry about flooding if it rained. It took maybe an hour to get the camp ready. Tent staked, sleeping bag unrolled, fire pit ringed with rocks, wood gathered. I cooked some noodles on the small stove, ate, then walked along the creek until it bent into thicker brush. There was no one else around, which at first felt like a blessing. By evening, I lit a fire and sat back watching the flames shift. The forest changed after the sun went down. The colors dimmed, the insects grew louder, and the trees seemed to close in around me. The air cooled faster than I expected. I pulled my jacket close, stretched out by the fire, and thought about how perfect this was. Alone, no stress, no noise. That first night went smoothly. I slept with only minor tossing and turning. The distant sound of the creek helped. The morning came with birdsong and weak sunlight cutting through the nylon walls of the tent. I felt good. I cooked oatmeal, packed water, and set out to hike one of the unmarked trails that cut through the forest. The trails weren't official, just faint paths worn by boots and deer hooves. I followed one that curved uphill through ridges covered with ferns. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The air felt heavy, filled only with the rustle of my boots and the occasional snap of twigs. I walked for hours, stopping to rest, drink, and listen. I saw no one. Not a single hiker, not even footprints that looked fresh. At some point, I came across a clearing where the grass had been pressed flat, almost like something large had been lying there. It wasn't a campsite, just an empty patch of earth surrounded by trees. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at it, wondering what could have made it. Deer, maybe, or an elk, though I wasn't sure if elk even lived in that forest. I shrugged it off and kept moving. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was sliding down. My legs ached, and my throat was dry. I cooked rice and beans, sat by the fire again, and felt tired in a satisfying way. That night was different. I woke up in the dark to the sound of movement outside the tent. Not just the usual rustle of leaves or the scamper of a squirrel. This was heavier. I froze, holding my breath, listening. Something crunched slowly through the pine needles, close enough that I felt its weight in the ground. I reached for my headlamp but didn't turn it on. The sound circled halfway around the tent, then faded toward the creek. I lay there for hours, ears straining. Every snap made me flinch. At some point, exhaustion dragged me back into sleep. The next morning, I stepped out and scanned the ground. There were impressions in the pine needles, wide and uneven, but not clear enough to tell if they were animal or human. My stomach felt tight, but I convinced myself it had been a deer nosing around the camp. That happened all the time. I had food in the cooler. Maybe it had smelled it. I tried to shake it off and went about the day. I hiked again, though not as far. I felt watched the whole time. Every bend in the trail made me glance back over my shoulder. My pace quickened until I finally returned to camp earlier than usual. That evening, I gathered more wood than I needed and built the fire larger, telling myself it was for warmth, though deep down it was for comfort. I sat close, letting the flames throw shadows against the trees. The night stretched slow, and I found myself staring into the dark beyond the fire's edge, waiting to catch movement. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again. The crunch of steps, slow, deliberate, not circling this time but stopping and starting. The fire had burned low. I fed it more sticks, making it flare, but when I looked out past the light, I saw nothing, just black trunks and brush. The steps came closer. I gripped the hatchet in my lap, palms sweating. I never saw anything, but the sound of breathing, faint but real, reached me before it stopped. Then silence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat awake, poking the fire until dawn. When the light finally came, I forced myself to search the perimeter. I found footprints this time. They weren't clear shoe prints, just partial depressions, but they were too long, too narrow, too irregular to be deer. My chest felt tight. I thought about leaving right then, but pride and stubbornness kept me. I had planned 3 nights, and I told myself I'd finish them. Besides, it was probably nothing serious. Maybe another camper wandering, maybe a hunter, maybe someone just cutting through. But the forest didn't feel the same anymore. It was heavy, watching. I spent most of the day sitting in camp, sharpening the knife, pretending to read a paperback I'd brought but never really turning the pages. Couldn't relax. Every sound made me turn my head. As night came again, dread crawled in with it. I built the fire even larger, stacked extra wood nearby, and placed my knife and hatchet within arm's reach. The creek gurgled steadily, but it wasn't comforting anymore. It only made the silence around it feel deeper. Hours dragged. The fire cracked. My eyes stung from the smoke. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. The same heavy steps, only this time closer. I froze, gripping the hatchet. The firelight didn't reach far enough, but I could hear the sound of branches brushing against something. The steps circled again. Slow, careful. I couldn't see who or what it was. Then I heard it, metal clinking. Not an animal, not deer. Metal, like something brushing against a buckle or a canteen. My blood ran cold. Someone was out there, moving around my camp in the dead of night. I shouted once, my voice raw, telling whoever it was to go. The forest swallowed the words. Silence followed. Then the steps retreated, fading into the dark. I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire until the sky turned gray. By morning, I had made my decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed quickly, stuffing gear into my pack, collapsing the tent with shaking hands. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted out. The hike back to the lot felt endless. Every sound behind me made me whip around. My pack dug into my shoulders. My breath came too fast. When I finally broke through the trees and saw the gravel lot, relief washed over me until I noticed it. My car had been tampered with. One of the back doors was open just a crack. The inside was rummaged through. Things were scattered, maps, wrappers, even the glove compartment empty. Someone had been there. Someone had followed me or gotten to my car while I was deep in the forest. I threw my pack inside, slammed the doors, and started the engine. The drive out was a blur. My hands shook the whole way. I never saw anyone. Not a face, not a figure. Just the evidence. The footprints. The circling at night. The breathing. The rummaged car. It was clear enough. I hadn't been alone in that forest. Someone had been watching me, moving around me, close enough to touch the tent if they wanted. Someone had waited for night, lingered, tested, but never stepped into the firelight. I don't camp alone anymore. I don't even drive past that forest. And the worst part is not knowing. Not knowing who it was or what they wanted or how long they had been watching before I even noticed. The quiet I went looking for is gone. Now, every time I hear a branch snap in the dark, I remember that night. And I know, without doubt, that it wasn't the forest I needed to be afraid of. It was the person hiding inside it. I had always enjoyed camping, but most of my trips had been short and simple. A night or two at state parks, places where campsites were lined up not far from each other, where the sound of cars on a nearby road was never completely gone, and where you could always see the glow of someone else's fire in the distance. I had never done a longer trip alone, and that was what I wanted to change that year. I was 26, and I wanted to challenge myself. I wanted to spend a week away from people, really out in the woods, living out of a tent with nothing but the gear I could carry. I had read enough about backcountry camping to know it was harder, riskier, and lonelier than the regular stuff I had done before, but I thought I was ready. I prepared carefully, buying a good sleeping bag, a strong backpack, a water filter, a small gas stove, and everything else that was supposed to make it manageable. The spot I picked was a stretch of national forest about 5 hours from where I lived. I studied maps, traced trails, and even marked down areas where other campers had written online about setting up for a few days. It seemed remote enough that I wouldn't be crowded, but not so remote that I would be lost in total wilderness. That balance was what made me choose it. When the day came, I loaded my car and drove out early in the morning. The farther I went, the fewer cars I saw, and eventually the road narrowed until I was winding through dense trees with no houses or towns in sight. Felt good at first, almost freeing. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was more excited than nervous. I set off carrying about 40 pounds of gear on my back. The trail started easy, wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, with the ground packed down hard from years of use. It was late summer, hot enough that sweat was soaking my shirt within the first hour, but the thick trees gave me enough shade to keep going. Birds called above me, the sound of cicadas buzzed through the woods, and once in a while I'd hear the quick scramble of a squirrel darting through the leaves. After about 3 hours, the trail thinned and twisted deeper into the woods. I saw fewer signs of other people the farther I went. At one point, I stopped near a small stream to fill my bottle with filtered water, sitting on a rock to rest. It was so quiet that I felt completely alone. That was exactly what I wanted, or at least that was what I told myself then. By late afternoon, I found a clearing that looked good for camp. The ground was flat, not too many rocks or roots, and it was close enough to a small creek for water but far enough to avoid dampness. I pitched my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and set up my little stove to make a meal. It felt almost perfect, like I had made the right choice in coming. That night, I lay awake for a while listening to the forest. Every little sound seemed louder without the comfort of other campers nearby. A branch snapping, a rustle in the underbrush. It all made me alert, even though I knew most of it was just animals moving around. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me to sleep. The next morning, I woke up stiff but rested. I boiled water for coffee, ate a quick breakfast, and packed a small bag for a hike farther into the forest without all my heavy gear. I wanted to see more of the area, maybe find a better spot for the next night. As I hiked, I noticed something strange. In a patch of dirt off the trail, I saw footprints. They weren't boot prints like mine, they looked more like the tread of cheap sneakers. The dirt was soft, and the prints were clear. They weren't fresh enough to be wet or sharp, but they hadn't been there long either. I crouched to look closer and realized there were at least 2 sets. Someone else had been here. That wouldn't have bothered me much normally. It was public land, after all, and other campers used it too. But the strange thing was how far from the main trail I already was. I hadn't seen anyone since I parked my car the day before, and I thought this part of the forest would be too far for most people who weren't planning to spend days out here. I shook it off and kept walking, but I noticed myself glancing behind me more often. By late afternoon, I headed back toward my tent. When I came into the clearing, I froze. Something was different. My backpack, which I had left leaning against a tree near the tent, was lying flat on the ground, unzipped. My heart thudded. I dropped my smaller bag and rushed forward. The tent was still there, closed. The stove and sleeping bag were still inside, but the backpack had definitely been opened. I checked through it quickly. My food was there, my water filter, my clothes. Nothing was missing, at least as far as I could tell. But someone had gone through my things. I stood there for a long time trying to convince myself that maybe I had left it unzipped. Maybe it had fallen over. But I knew that wasn't true. I was careful. I had zipped it before leaving. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. That night was the longest night I had ever spent outdoors. I climbed into the tent and zipped it shut, but I barely slept. Every snap of a branch made me think someone was outside. I gripped the small hatchet I had brought for cutting wood and kept it close by. My ears strained for sounds of footsteps, but all I heard was the endless noise of the forest. When morning finally came, I decided not to move camp just yet. I tried to convince myself it had been nothing. I boiled water, ate, and sat for a while staring at the trees, trying to calm down. By midday, I almost believed it. Then I found the rope. I had walked a short way into the trees to collect some dead branches for firewood when I saw it. A length of dirty, frayed rope tied around the trunk of a tree. It wasn't new, but it hadn't been there long either. The bark underneath was still raw where it had been rubbed. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. It didn't look like anything to do with camping. It looked like something someone had tied for another reason. I left the wood and went back to camp, my mind racing. I told myself again and again to stay calm, but it was getting harder. That night, as darkness settled over the forest, I heard it. Footsteps, not animals, heavier, slower, deliberate. They crunched in the dry leaves just beyond the circle of light from my small fire. I sat frozen inside my tent, holding my hatchet, hardly breathing. The steps came closer, then stopped. For what felt like forever, there was nothing. Then I heard it again, farther away this time, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I made my decision. I was going to leave. I had planned to spend a week out there, but I no longer cared. Something was wrong, and I didn't want to wait to find out what. I packed everything as quickly as I could, stuffed it into my backpack, and started down the trail. My eyes darted to every shadow, every shape between the trees. My hands gripped the straps of my pack so tightly my knuckles hurt. Hours passed. I was getting closer to the trailhead when I saw something that made my chest go cold. Off the side of the trail, on the trunk of a tree, was a carving. Just a rough line cut into the bark, but fresh enough that pale wood showed underneath. Next to it was another, and another, forming a crude arrow pointing in the direction I was walking. I slowed down, my throat dry. Someone had marked the trail, and not long ago. The sun was getting low, and I knew I wouldn't make it to my car before dark. I had to set up camp one more time. I chose a spot close to the trail, but hidden enough that I hoped it wouldn't be seen. I pitched the tent quickly, skipped dinner, and climbed inside, heart pounding so hard I thought it would shake the fabric. That night, the footsteps came again, closer this time. They circled my camp slowly, crunching leaves, snapping twigs. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The steps stopped right outside my tent. For minutes that dragged like hours, there was silence. Then, so faint I almost thought I imagined it, I heard the sound of someone breathing. I stayed like that until dawn, gripping the hatchet, staring at the fabric of the tent as if I could see through it. When the first light came, I unzipped the tent and looked around. No one was there, but pressed into the dirt not 10 feet away was a single footprint. A sneaker tread, the same as the ones I had seen days earlier. I didn't bother with breakfast. I grabbed my gear, left the tent behind, and started walking fast. My legs burned. My shoulders ached under the weight of the pack, but I didn't stop. By late afternoon, the trees thinned, and I saw the parking lot through the branches. Relief crashed over me so hard I almost stumbled. My car was still there, untouched. I threw my gear into the back, jumped in, and drove away without looking behind me. Only once I was on the main road did I finally breathe. I never went back to that forest, and I never camped alone again.